Hello everyone, Alexei Berlikov is here. Today we are talking about Donald Trump's statements with the Americanist Radosław Rybkowski. Welcome.
Good morning.
So let's start with the most surprising things. First, Trump makes vulgar statements about Israel and Iran, and then his vice president shows the middle finger. Is this supposed to be a new form of diplomacy now? How can this be clarified?
This is, of course, a rhetorical question, but I believe that during his previous term, Donald Trump was actually preparing us for the fact that forms of expression and gestures that were previously unacceptable, completely inappropriate in the world of diplomacy, are suddenly becoming part of the political mainstream. I would say that such a moment showing that we are dealing with a completely different way of communicating with the world was the visit of President Zelensky to the White House. Until now, it did not happen, perhaps in the Middle Ages, when it was necessary to humiliate a subject, some feudal lord wanted to humiliate someone, it behaved in this way. However, the organization of this meeting showed us in which direction it was going. And what happened now? That is, the way of such a Wugandy commentary on the Israeli-Iranian war, the behavior of Vice President Vance, is only a continuation of what began a few months earlier.
Now about the NATO summit. Trump met with Zelensky there, although he had not planned such a meeting before. Why did he change his mind, and why now he calls Zelensky a decent guy, a good boy?
Again, you shouldn't get too attached to what Donald Trump is saying at the moment. Because it has happened to us many times before. Events about a person occurred overnight. The fact that he is speaking quite sympathetically about Zelensky at this point does not mean that tomorrow he will not speak more sympathetically about Putin. The fact that he speaks critically about Putin does not mean that in a week he will not say that Vladimir Putin is a wonderful man who cares about his nation and wants peace. You can comment on some such current statements of Donald Trump, but they are still a comment on what he said at this point. That doesn't mean that it doesn't define how Donald Trump will talk and act next week. So the fact that he is speaking, okay, we are very happy, but from our European point of view, yes, it is better for it to speak positively about Zelensky, about the president of Ukraine. But in Europe, we're used to the fact that just because he's saying nice things at this point doesn't define how Donald Trump is going to behave. What policy will the United States pursue next week?
It's different, right? Donald Trump, his talk, and American politics. Parallel.
And yes, let's remember again, the American system is quite specific. According to the Constitution, the government is the president. Hence, it is different than in relation to many other countries. I don't know if there is such a clear distinction in Ukrainian, but in Polish there is quite an important distinction, because we talk about Donald Trump's administration, and we don't talk much about Donald Trump's government. Why? Because the government is Donald Trump. He has the administration to help. And unlike in other countries where we are dealing with a government, like in Poland, we have a prime minister and ministers. And the Prime Minister is the most important. He also chooses his associates, but each of the ministers has their own, truly own, constitutional responsibility for what they do. In the case of the United States, the only one who is truly responsible is Donald Trump, and all the rest is there to help him. And for this reason, if we try to consider to what extent this is Donald Trump's statement and to what extent it is American policy, we must say that in the case of the United States it is the same. Donald Trump ultimately decides about everything. Donald Trump, also as the commander-in-chief of the American army, he finally decided, we will bomb nuclear facilities, nuclear infrastructures in Iran. It was not the Secretary of Defense or the head of the Pentagon who could make such a decision on his own. No, it was Donald Trump who had to make such a decision.
But now he must clarify this decision before the Congress?
Yes, he has to talk about it before the Congress. He has to explain himself. But let's remember that the explanation that it was necessary to ensure security in the Persian Gulf region, to ensure the security of Israel, the United States, the whole world, in the face of the Republican majority in Congress, will be a sufficient explanation. It's not that Donald Trump has a decisive, definitely reluctant Congress towards him. No, because the Republicans have a majority, so the Congress is favorable to Donald Trump. It will not be a problem for him to explain to Congress that the actions it took were appropriate and effective.
Okay, what is the main mission of President Duda during the NATO campaign and what is its whole task that Poland is setting itself now?
President Duda, regardless of these internal political disputes in Poland, whether the president is in some opposition to the Polish government, or the government is in relation to President Duda, there is also no doubt that both the president and the government are absolutely in favor of increasing defense spending. Poland, as part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as part of the European members of the alliance, is the country that has recently insisted most strongly on increasing this spending. And Poland itself came out with it. Not that we said, then all of you others spend more, but Poland itself began to spend more on top of the proposed 5% of GDP as defense spending. Let us remember that 1.5% of this is related to infrastructure, i.e. not directly for defense, but for support of the entire infrastructure that can be useful for defense. This can be used to strengthen the network of roads, transport, so that it is easier to relocate troops if necessary, cybersecurity, etc. President Duda also said it so much. He is so glad that this Polish point of view of the need to increase defense spending has been accepted by the entire North Atlantic Treaty. Why? Why is he happy? Why are we happy in Poland? If all countries of the European Union, European countries belonging to NATO, really increase these defense spending, then Europe itself, the European part of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, will be much safer. Among other things, because it will not always have to look at the United States and the support of the United States, and that there will not be a situation like it was many years ago during the war in the former Yugoslavia. Europe was basically complaining, sniffing that something had to be done and that this conflict should be ended, but until the United States moved, used its aircraft carriers stationed in the Mediterranean, and used its strength, Europe did nothing.
na Morzu Śródziemnym i nie użyły swoich siły. Tak naprawdę
Why
nic,
didn't they do
Europa
anything?
nic nie zrobiła. Czemu nic nie
Because
zrobiła?
Europe was also militarily too weak and it always watched at the actions of the United States.
Oglądała się zawsze w działaniach swoich na Stany Zjednoczone. Myślę, że
I think this is with the obviously exorbitant costs that Ukraine is incurring and what it has to suffer.
niebotycznych kosztach, jakie ponosi Ukraina, prawda?
The fact that the Russian aggression has shown Europe that we cannot always look to the United States thinking that the United States will defend us,
Europie, że nie możemy się zawsze oglądać na Stany Zjednoczone.
and that they will come to our aid. Even if they come, let's also remember to relocate forces.
Nawet jeżeli przyjdą, prawda, to pamiętajmy też, że relokowanie sił
It takes some time.
to zajmuje jakiś czas.
As we have seen even with what happened during this Iran-Israel conflict, it is not the case that these bombers took off and were already able to attack targets in Iran.
To nie jest tak, że te bombowce wystartowały, już mogły, prawda, atakować cele w Iranie. Nie,
No,
najpierw
the air tankers that provided fuel on the route between the United States and targets in Iran and on the way back had to be relocated first.
Pomiędzy Stanami Zjednoczonymi a celami w Iranie oraz w drodze powrotnej. Czyli
Even in the case of the Air Force, in the case of bombers that can fly around the globe, it turns out that we still have to prepare.
okazuje się, że i tak musimy się przygotować. Okej, to trwa krócej, bo przelecenie samolotem.
Okay, it takes less time, because it doesn't take weeks to fly by plane to the other side of the Atlantic, but it can't be the case either, or we can't assume that the United States will be able to support Europe, the members of the alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty.
Europę, członków Sojuszu, Paktu Północnoatlantyckiego.
The Baltic states are threatened, Finland is certainly threatened, Sweden feels threatened due to the actions of both the Air Force and the Navy of the Russian Federation.
Zarówno lotnictwo, jak i marynarze.
That you can't think about it. Okay, so let the Americans strike now, because they will strike, they will support us at the earliest, in a few days at the earliest.
Wesprą nas najwcześniej za kilka dni.
Trump demands 5% from others, but not from the United States. Is it fair? How will Poles, usually citizens, react to this? What do you think?
Of course, you can say that it's proportional, that this is not preserved, this, true, calls others and so on, but the Americans also have, regardless of the fact that I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, right? This is an argument that the Americans can use and it's very rational.
Donalda Trumpa, prawda? To argument, jaki Amerykanie mogą użyć, i on jest bardzo racjonalny.
For many, many years, it was the United States that spent the most proportionally, the most GDP on defense and so on.
PKB najwięcej na cele obronne i tak dalej. To
This is what they spent on the development of new military technologies. This F-35 fighter was created in cooperation with many countries, but the United States was the one that spent the most money to develop this design. The United States, even if it spends less now, it will kind of compensate for the time when it spent more than the others.
prawda? Że Stany Zjednoczone, nawet jeżeli teraz będą wydawać mniej, to jakby to zrekompensuje im ten czas, kiedy wydawały więcej niż pozostali,
And the second argument that should be taken into account,
który należy wziąć pod uwagę.
the GDP of the United States is definitely larger than that of any other country, and it is definitely larger than that of any other NATO country.
Większe niż jakiegokolwiek innego kraju należącego do NATO.
So even if we look at the number of inhabitants, per capita, the expenses that are incurred, the United States will still be ahead of us.
Na głowę mieszkańca te wydatki, jakie są ponoszone,
Let's remember that the United States has 340 million inhabitants there.
pamiętajmy, tam 340 milionów mieszkańców.
With their GDP, their spending in nominal terms, how much dollars they spend on defense, is much more than Poland will spend, I don't know, Spain.
Na obronność. No, przekracza zdecydowanie.
Spain asked for it anyway, agreeing to 5%. Please not demand it from us right away.
Hiszpania i tak poprosiła o ten, prawda, godząc się na
Perhaps this is due to the fact that Spain is so far away from the Russian Federation that it seems to them that they do not have to spend so much money on defense at the moment, because they are relatively safe.
w tym momencie tak bardzo dużo środków pieniężnych wydawać na obronność, bo są w miarę bezpieczni.
A threat from Morocco, which is also the only country with which it really shares a border due to these two Spanish exclaves in the north of Morocco.
Na te dwie eksklawy hiszpańskie na północy Maroka. No to
However, this is small compared to what we feel here in Central Europe.
z tym, jakie my tutaj
Finland,
mamy,
the Baltic states due to their proximity to the Russian Federation.
jak kraje bałtyckie my ze względu na bliskość Federacji Rosyjskiej.
So Trump said that we always have problems with Spain. One more thing. The US Army may be withdrawn from the continent. At least such talks are taking place. Can American bases in Poland really be closed?
Let us remember that this is not talking about total liquidation. It is about a significant reduction. Donald Trump said during his first term in office, but why such a large presence of American troops, for example, in Germany? Let us remember at the time when these American bases were established in West Germany. It was East Germany belonging to the Warsaw Pact. So this presence was necessary because it was a border country. West Germany was a border country. Besides, in their election program, the Republicans and President Donald Trump clearly indicate that they want to reduce the presence of American troops outside the country. Why? Because they have more serious economic problems at home. Of course, we can feel anxious about it, we can feel some sadness, and certainly not happy that the number of American soldiers is decreasing, but on the one hand, the Americans will certainly remain, because there are missile defense installations that are necessary in Poland and they must remain. Otherwise, this whole missile defense system will fall apart for the Americans. So they can withdraw from some other places, from other bases, but for sure the American troops in Poland will stay anyway. It withdrew partially, as the Deputy Prime Minister, our Minister of National Defense, said. It withdrew from fulfilling this duty of defending the airport in Jastrzębie near Rzeszów. But we will take over other NATO countries. And now, if we thought, it is good for European countries to defend Europe. Let the Americans stay and certainly not withdraw completely, because at least some of the air bases will be left here, so that these non-American tankers can safely spend the night somewhere, refuel and possibly take off. We were now on this long weekend with my wife in Crete, in Hania, and when our plane was taking off, we could see a dozen of these solid tankers. We had our short vacation and rest, but it turned out that a few kilometers from us, the war was not directly, but lasting, because these tankers had to take off from there to provide fuel to the B-2 bombers that were flying to attack targets in Iran. So yes, the Americans can reduce, they can reduce significantly, they will definitely stay. It is known that there is this American fleet that is stationed in the Mediterranean. Why? Because it is too important for the military presence of the United States for them to be able to afford their absence. They may not declare it strongly, but some American submarine will definitely sail. Also, as part of this deterrence strategy, it has nuclear weapons at its disposal with the awareness that if this cataclysm occurs, it is the weapon of the final defeat that the Americans will have.
Thank you.